This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 15. Story by Robert McKee. Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And today we're talking about a very cool book that's called
Story, Substance, Structure, Style, and the Principles of Screenwriting by Robert McKee.
We've mentioned this briefly, I believe, on the cast, how this is a book that when I read through it, really hit home for me in a lot of ways. We've talked a lot before on our other podcast, Backward Compatible, and of course, through school and study and all this different stuff. Even in the course of our designing RPGs, because we're very interested in story structure and how we sort of present story through role-playing games. We sort of, in a way, organically came to these conclusions about what we think story should be or how it should work, how it's structured. And that's also partially based on, kind of a formal education in the humanities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, kinda. Said doc.
The doc stands for doctor, as in PhD.
Hello, I am doctor.
But then what this book did is very succinctly and very, its whole thesis, I think, really spoke to our philosophy that we kind of come to over the years.
Yeah, that's very true. If I had had this book whenever I was teaching a course called Mechanics of Story, I would have assigned it. I would have used it, and I would have stolen from it liberally, because it was a liberal arts college. See, so that's what you do. But more to the point, I think that there's let's call it a knowledge gap right now. And it's funny, the book actually acknowledges that straight up in the first chapter or so. And the idea behind it is that in the last 25 years or so, we have embraced this idea that everyone is creative and that anyone can write. And those are both just lies. They're totally untrue, including me and pretty much anybody. Some people, a few select people, have the natural gift, okay? But for the most part, most of us have to work really, really hard to understand what the formulas are and when to use them and when not to use them. And I think that's the key, is that if you go too far into formula, you're just derivative. And that's a valid argument. But at the same time, if you're just doing free flowing stream of consciousness, whatever, all yours, Virginia Woolf, which, she had her time and place and her day, certainly. But I think that there's room for everything in between. And to me, I think that there's incredible value in a succinct and easy to read guide. And that's exactly what Story by McKee is.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about it, too, is that he does share his methodology in particular, and he shares a lot of his philosophy around how story should be structured and how scenes should work and that sort of thing. And read a certain way, it does come across as almost formulaic, at least as far as here are the elements that need to be in a scene or in a story. And yet he is constantly reinforcing the idea too that you can't just write to formula. You have to sort of write in the way that's appropriate for the story you're telling. And he also makes a lot of very strong statements about telling the truth in storytelling, as I think kind of the way he puts it. That is to say, whether or not it's actually the case, you you have to dig into your understanding of the world, and your story. And every story, I think he argues, is making an argument for life is like this.
Yeah, that's true.
Essentially, the story is trying to make a case for the audience without stating that. The audience comes away understanding that through the story that you've told.
Yeah. Well, I love, there's a section that really spoke to me, and again, it was early on, where he says that early in this century, a number of American universities came to believe that, like musicians and painters, writers need the equivalent of music or art school to learn the principles of their craft. And to that end, lots of different scholars, I'm paraphrasing here, wrote about how to do this. They wrote excellent books on dramaturgy and prose arts, and their method was intrinsic, drawing strength from the big muscle movements of desire. But then, over the last 25 years or so, as I was saying, the method of teaching went extrinsic, and American universities shifted so that trends in literary theory have drawn professors away from that deep source of story, almost like it was a dirty thing to look at the formula. And he actually goes on to say that this is even worse in Europe, that European academics generally deny that writing can in any case be taught. And as a result, courses in creative writing have never been included in the curriculum of continental universities. That's fascinating to me. And so as the pendulum swings, and those of us who have studied education, which is different from being in education, but actually studying it as well, know that in academia, the pendulum swings. Different philosophy comes and goes, and in about 30 years, call it a generation, things will cycle back around again. And so where we are in terms of storytelling specifically is right on the cusp, I believe, of turning back towards some of the traditional forms of storytelling. Because if you look at the movies that are popular right now, what you have is movies like, well, I'm going to pick on the superhero movies, right? Just the Marvel verse. Most of those don't have a plot, or if they do, it's very, very simple. There's not a deep mystery that's solved or anything like that. What you have is kind of a series of like YouTube clips of punching things and exploding things and quips all strung together into an action film. I actually really dislike that tendency. It's eye candy and it's incredibly pretty. And I really, I get the adrenaline rush when I see them. But the truth is, I don't look forward to those movies, and I don't really care.
And to be fair, there are some in the Marvel-verse that are actually quite good.
Oh yeah,
from
some
a
of them.
perspective.
And to be fair, I liked some of those too. Like the first Captain America, I enjoyed that one immensely.
Actually, the whole Captain America series has been pretty good.
That has, yeah.
Black Panther was also very good. I liked that one quite a bit.
I haven't seen that one, so I won't say anything about that one. I keep being told that I need to see it. But the problem is, fool me once, et cetera, et cetera. I guess really where I'm going with all of that is to compare with, for example, a movie that also came out recently, which is Ready Player One. And that one definitely had a plot. And whenever you see the changes that were made, this is the transmedia scholar in me talking here, when you see the changes that were made from, let's call it book to script, I think that they were absolutely spot on. The massive lists got shifted over into stuff in the background, and you could focus on the story at that point. So to me, I think that is one of the key elements to understanding how this all ties into RPGs, which is, of course, what we design, and the stories that are being told by the players. Because we, Duck and Krueger, don't hand players story. We hand them, I would say, a toolbox to be able to create the story.
Yeah, and I think that, to that point, it is a book primarily about screenwriting. But the principles he's drawing on are very much universal principles of storytelling.
Well, they are. That's true.
He does focus in on the art and craft of screenwriting in particular. And that definitely comes through in the way he talks about the audience's experience in the theater and that sort of thing. Of course, screenwriting is also going to imply a certain length of media, which is quite different from tabletop role-playing games most of the time.
Very true.
However, I think that there's a lot to be gleaned, like the same principles that, again, resonated with me when I read this book, that kind of put into words some of the things that I very strongly believed, but didn't like have a way to put as succinctly as he does.
Sure. We need the lingo. We need to have a common vocabulary in order to be able to speak about these things. And that's exactly what the book is about and is for. And I think there's way too much for us to be able to just sort of regurgitate here in this short time. But I think that there is certainly enough time for us to talk about the main points that he covers, and we can talk about how he organizes the material. And the way that he organizes the material in a key form is into, let's call it 3 major categories. And those 3 major categories are what he calls the elements of story, the principles of story design, and the writer at work. And I love that third category. Back in the day, whenever I taught a class called Mechanics of Story, and the one where I would have loved to have had this book, I did a very similar thing. I actually organized my class into every other week being an element of story, and then every other week being sort of a principle of design. And I organized those within the context of nonlinear story and ergodic story and things like that. But What I did not do, I am ashamed to say, is this idea of writer at work. We did little exercises and things, but the depth to which he goes into really connecting the author and authorship into the work that is being created, I think is brilliant. I think that is what sets this book even beyond sort of the early books that he talks about from the turn of the century, from the 30s and 40s, that this is truly a modern work because of the examples that are being given. So that said, when we look at what he calls the elements of story, it's a pretty short list. He's got a chapter called The Structure Spectrum, and then in that he outlines the 4 different connections to structure: structure and setting, structure and genre, structure and character, and structure and meaning. And the following 4 chapters are those titles. And so obviously structure is a really important idea to him. So how do you think that connects then to, say, the concept of an RPG or telling a story within the context of structure?
I know that some games will do this more so than others. Our philosophy tends to be, in most of the games that we've designed so far that we've been working on, try to build something of a structure into the play cycle organically.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the things that an RPG, that a story game can have some of the most influence over. I would say that maybe the 2 things that you can most influence through your systems are going to be the structure of the story based on the cycle of play, and then the ways that characters might grow and evolve or be prompted to behave based on the rules of the game, and also what is on the character sheet, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, that makes perfect sense, because in that same first chapter of structure, McKee says that structure is a selection of events from the character's life stories that is composed into a strategic sequence to arouse specific emotions and to express a specific view of life. That could be straight out of an RPG. I mean, you could crack open a book and see that as the definition of how you should structure your game. And so in that sense, I think that there's a huge resonance between the stories that we tell across the table and the stories that we have ingested, let's say, after decades, in my case, 4 decades of media consumption. There's no coincidence, I think, that especially in, let's call them the genre agnostic games, like the ones that Krueger makes, or some of the other indie games that are out there, there's much more of a focus, as we've talked about in previous podcasts, on that narrative and what the narrative structure is, and the individual characters telling the story, instead of it being a more linear and on rails kind of campaign. But there's an interesting, I think, juxtaposition there, because, at least for me, a movie is not interactive beyond interacting with the movie by sitting and watching and reacting to it as an individual. I love going to see movies with my wife, and I love talking about those movies afterwards. Well, why do we bother? Why do we bother to talk about them afterwards? We saw the same movie. Obviously, we had the same reaction, and we knew exactly what the other was thinking, right?
Right.
No. Well, no. No. That's for starters. I don't want to get into marriage life here, but no, you have no idea what your spouse is thinking. No. But the whole point, I think, of even structured media that is not interactive is we all come at it slightly different. And you watch a movie you haven't seen in 10 years. You'll see that movie differently than you yourself, the same person, because you're not the same person, saw that movie 10 years ago. And I think in that sense, all forms of media are interactive. But I think it's so fascinating to me that whenever we take control of the story over the tabletop, suddenly what do we snap to? It's the structures that work within a more traditional linear narrative, like a film. And I think that's why there's such applicability here.
I forget off the top of my head who it was who said this, but it's someone who's very influential in the indie RPG design space. And one of the principles of the game they were known for states that you should do the obvious thing as kind of like just a general rule to approach things, where you don't want to overthink how you're playing your character, how you're structuring your story, aside from what maybe like the designer has done on your behalf and the way they designed the game. But once you get into it, don't overthink your decisions. Just do the thing that feels right, the thing that feels obvious, so to speak.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that kind of speaks to some of the stuff that McKee says in Story when it comes down to the fundamentals of character motivation and where the plot needs to go based on things like the inciting incident and all this different stuff, which I believe we might be about to get into here in this run through of the table of contents.
Okay, so I guess the second section then would be the principles of story design. And so McKee talks about those as being the substance of story, the inciting incident, act design, scene analysis, composition, and crisis, climax, and resolution. And each of those is kind of its own chapter. There's about 7 chapters there. So this idea of the principles of story design, I think, is where a lot of people have their strong reaction in today's climate and culture of, no, that's derivative. Mm-hmm. We can't write to formula. Then I'm not being creative. Talk me off of that ledge.
Tropes is kind of a dirty word these days.
Said the T word.
Yes. I think they're confused often with cliche.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I don't think that, I think that tropes are essentially a tool that we can use as a shorthand to communicate an idea very quickly to an audience that's familiar with it. I think this also plays a lot into myth studies, symbology, different words having different connotations, different stories that like we have like the shared knowledge of our culture and our society and our stories that all kind of lead us to be able to say, like, even just the use of metaphor or terms of speech, beating a dead horse. We're not talking about literally beating a dead horse with sticks.
That's
we're talking
so
about, what that implies, that we're revisiting a moot point or whatever the case might be. And so I think that metaphor extends into trope and it extends into kind of common story elements where there is something that resonates with us. There's something that we can kind of go to have, okay, here we're on the same page now. We have this understanding. Even as far as people talk about the hero's journey specifically, I would say that you can simplify the hero's journey even more into having the inciting incident being the thing that causes a change in an environment, that causes the character or whatever the case might be to need to transform in order to get to a new status quo, essentially, that is then broken again. Yeah. And so the hero's journey, while like you might get a little bit too formulaic if you're trying to hit the checklist of like, oh, I need to have this specific thing that Campbell mentioned, this specific thing. You don't even have to do that, but just the core of story structure. I'm drawing a blank, and I think we've mentioned his name before, but the guy who talks about like how every story is essentially the same mono structure.
Cal Bashir?
Bashir. That's right.
Yeah. Cal Bashir is a current scholar right now who's working in monomyth spaces and doing some really cool stuff. Mm-hmm. Hit his website if you want more on that one. And for more on the tropes discussion, we actually did a full episode on that on the backward-compatible.com podcast with our excellent co-host Jim. So, but here's what McKee has to say about this. He says that a story is a design in 5 parts, and I love that word, design. The inciting incident, in italics, is the first major event of the telling. It's the primary cause for all that follows, putting into motion the other 4 elements: progressive complications, crisis, climax, and resolution. And that is very, very similar to the old Freytag's triangle, which is actually it's kind of an 18th, 19th century model by a German scholar of story and story structure named Freytag. I think it was Gustav Freytag. And if you just Google image search like Freytag's triangle, you'll instantly have about 1 million variations of that one. And what's interesting is if then you map that triangle of the rising action with the classic X, Y, what you've got is that Y becomes time, and X almost without exception represents something like drama or tension, dramatic tension, right? And you see that just universally as what is the other thing as you're going through the story. The other metric is that tension. It's that story tension. And without that, you really don't have a story. You might have a documentary. You might have some wonderful nature footage. But I think it's human nature to think of events in those, in those terms. Even in our own lives, whenever we have a bad thing happen, suddenly, what is that? That's a conflict. That is an inciting incident. Oh no, my driver's license is expired and I'm going to have to go, I don't know, pay a fee and get it. And I hope I don't get stopped by a cop on the way.
The threshold guardian.
Yeah, suddenly, right, exactly. So suddenly, what's happened is we've turned this into a narrative. You start a movie with that sort of a scene happening, and it can become almost a symbol for the deeper thing that's going to happen later. And maybe the inciting incident happens whenever the Terminator walks into the DMV. You know what I'm saying?
And that brings me to something that I find even more so than trying to design, say, as the GM, or maybe if you've got a game that's a little bit more collaboratively run, the players all contributing to the story.
Right.
But just the design of your own character. I've played in a lot of campaigns where I had a character with kind of an interesting idea, but no real place to go with them in the story.
Yeah.
I didn't really have that like driving motivator. And one of the things that McKee talks about that I think is very, very important for story design in general is a character motivation that, as he puts it, is like life and death for that character. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean literally, but it's pretty darn close, at least in that character's view. So as the example of the getting your driver's license back, if your livelihood, if your way of life, even if you could technically live without a driver's license, and maybe discovering that you can as part of that story arc.
Not in Texas.
But to you, losing your driver's license is a quote unquote life and death situation.
Sure.
And that is sufficient motivation to force you into action. Because one of the arguments he makes in the book that I really like is that a character is never going to take anything other than the minimum required step. And, we talk about, for example, later on in this season, we'll be talking a little bit about Fate, which is a really great system. And one of the things they talk about when designing characters is that they are competent and that they're motivated and that they're dramatic. Or they're proactive, I should say, which is it ties into the motivation. And so for some reason, you're sort of skipping over the part for them where you figure out why it is that they're proactive, why it is that they're going to take action. But if you're playing any other character, we're not assuming that you have to figure out what it is that will drive them to act.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you start to get into unbelievable stuff where a character maybe is doing things that don't feel justified, or even as a player, for myself, I don't know what I want to do next.
Yeah.
It's like I really have no reason to do anything other than sit here and listen to you guys talk.
Exactly.
Because there's nothing that is forcing me to action.
Well, and I guess as a screenwriter, it's easy for us to say, okay, now I need to throw a conflict into the way of a character in order to let that character's attributes come out. But in a game situation, depending on the system, depending on the GM, depending on the players, it might be a little more difficult to sort of naturally have something like that occur. And that's why some systems will actually reward the player for putting conflict into the way of their own characters. And I enjoy those kind of a system, especially whenever the GM doesn't have to be responsible for trying to predict how comfortable or uncomfortable a player is whenever they are just being beaten to death. They might be having lots of fun just being a merchant, whereas somebody else is sitting back going, more orcs, come on, So McKee puts it this way. He calls it the principle of antagonism, and actually that's one of the chapters in the final section. He says that a protagonist and his story can only be as intellectually fascinating and emotionally compelling as the forces of antagonism make them. And I think that's brilliant, because what it means is that, like a bobber in water, you're going to rise to the top of the water. But if the water level is at a non-threatening level, the bobber's not doing anything interesting. And so if you've got a character who's a lead weight, that's not interesting. And if you've got no real flood, suddenly this has turned into a flood myth. If you've got no flood, then the cataclysm hasn't happened, and you're not an interesting character then either. And you've got to find that balance between the order and the chaos narratively. And I think that's what life is about. So it makes sense to me that that's where the good stories happen, whether that be a screenplay or an RPG.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we can round that out then by saying what the rest of his chapters are. And in addition to the principle of antagonism, there is a section on exposition, problems and solutions, character, the text, and a writer's method. And I really enjoy his interaction with the writer at work. That whole section is called the writer at work because of, as I said before, because of the almost personal way that he encourages the writer to write and to think of it as a craft and to think of it as a discipline, but at the same time, be very aware of how you're working, where you're working, and the medium in which you're working. Mm-hmm. And I found his message to be very, very encouraging. That, listen, maybe you're writing garbage now, but give it a few years and keep writing, and you're going to be telling better stories. And I think that that's the lesson of all GMs, frankly. Mm-hmm. The first time you sit behind the screen, metaphorically, we don't really use screens in our games, but I think that the GM can be, terrified. I know I was, and I had no idea whether or not I was going to be wasting my players' next 30 hours. And it turns out that the games that I've run, much more recently, and the stories I've told much more recently have been way better than those early ones. But at the same time, a lot of that has to do with how much you hand off to the players too, and your willingness to do that as a GM. But then that kind of gets us off into some of the other, systems and philosophies and other things that go beyond just good storytelling.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that kind of leads me into a caveat we can give when we say that, you should definitely take a look at this book and see how it influences the way you think about character and story and that sort of thing. But I would also say take what you can from it without worrying too much about whether or not in the course of a game you're telling like this really compelling story, because one of the things that he really does emphasize is it's all about revision.
Absolutely.
And in the course of a live role-playing game, you don't really have the opportunity to revise.
It's your mistakes are in real time.
It's all happening in real time. And, maybe the closest thing you can get to it is learning from how this past session went, maybe things that I could do or we as a group could do better the next time or the next game or whatever the case might be.
Well, having just wholeheartedly agreed with you, I am going to actually push back against that and contradict myself just a tad by saying this. Some of our most successful moments in role-playing have been whenever we've retconned something or said, oh, okay, so that moment ago, whenever we were under that tree and having that discussion, he actually said this, and we just add a little bit more. It's like the scene cut too early and we'll do a deleted scene kind of thing. Or we might even go as far as to have a flashback or something like that at a later time. And that can be incredibly powerful if your group is open to it and your GM is not, terrified by those kinds of ideas. So, and some of the systems have that built into them. Blades in the Dark comes to mind as the core mechanic of that is flashback. Otherwise, I completely agree with you.
And so, as I said, I think that there's a lot that can be gleaned from this book for a role player. What you get out of it might be different than what, say, like Doc and I've gotten out of it. Like I mentioned, even that my big takeaway from it being someone who plays more than I GM is just how I can design my characters or think about my characters, or even on a sort of a scene by scene basis, how I can approach things in order to make them narratively interesting, what I can introduce next in order to sort of keep advancing the plot towards some end, whether that be my own personal character arc or whether that be something for the greater story.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, whenever we, as Doc and Krueger, create systems, one of the things that we have challenged ourselves to consistently do is to think in terms of the players first and foremost. We want the GM to be more of a facilitator than a storyteller, and that's not to say that the GM can't tell a story. Absolutely, they can. But for us, it's actually more about the players contributing more, not less. Because and this is maybe a little bit meta, but the idea that you are telling a story at players and that they're kind of slogging through it and then maybe it'll get better and maybe they stick around, but we like the socialization, so we kind of do this story. We don't ever want that to be the case. What we want is for people to be craving that next session. And if the GM dropped out, you could almost like replace him. But the characters and the players are core. They're central to that. And I think that is so not what happens whenever a single screenwriter sits down to write a play. But I think there's a lot more of a comparison there to, say, a team of writers on a television show. There's been a big to-do about Stranger Things lately and whether or not that third season was going to happen or not, and that kind of a thing. But the truth is, their whole writing team continued working, and they kept doing and they kept going. And so now that they've got the green light, boom, it's happening. And I think that's important as we see shows like Lost in Space that literally just got sort of out of nowhere popped onto Netflix. It was like, oh my goodness, this is so amazing. And I just binge watched the whole thing, and it was great. To me, there's, I think, a comparison to that kind of a screenwriting, which McKee doesn't talk as much about because it's TV writing, to what we do in an RPG space. And I think that connection could be made because of the sort of ownership of the actors on set. And there's a tie in there. Maybe we can do another show on that sometime. I don't know.
Yeah. And so in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to kind of wrap it up there. There's so much more we could talk about, kind of digging deep into the specifics of how he breaks down scenes and how he breaks down different parts of the plot and the structure. And one thing I will say about the book that's really excellent, especially I imagine it will appeal to a lot of role players, is there's lots of great charts and illustrations of these concepts that kind of like put them in like kind of gives you this
really are.
spatial relationship between different things, which is really cool. So it's a fantastic book. I don't say that about a lot of books about like writing and storytelling and that sort of thing. This one I think is really, really a must read for anyone who's interested in this. So highly recommend it. Go check it out and see what it can do for your role play.
Yep. And you read it in pulp, but I read it in the digital format. And I really liked that because I could carry the ebook version with me around on my phone and just consult it at any point because I do a lot of writing at Starbucks and things like that. It's I know it's tropey, but hey, we embrace tropes, right?
Yep. So thank everyone for joining us for season 1, episode 15 of the Doc and Krueger cast, our discussion on Story by Robert McKee. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.